In the harsh wind-swept terrain of New Mexico Territory, 1,869, nestled between the crumbling edges of the Sierra Blanca Range and an ever-looming line of distant dancing heat waves, lived a woman named Clara Whitlock, a widow since her husband Jonah died 2 years prior defending their land from a raid that scorched more than the fields. Clara had become somewhat of a legend in the nearby settlements, not because of her strength but because of her silence. They said she spoke only to her chickens, wrote letters she never mailed, and still set 2 plates at the table every evening as if Jonah might ride in with the dusk. Alone on 60 acres of dry hope and weathered lumber, Clara's days passed like dust devils quiet, swirling and filled with barely tethered energy. That quiet was shattered one blistering afternoon when she opened her cabin door and found a bloodied Apache warrior slumped against her woodpile, barely breathing, his chest marked with bullet holes and sunburn. Her first thought wasn't to grab a gun, it was to grab a bucket of water. Why? Even she didn't know. Perhaps it was the humanity she saw buried under war paint and dried blood, or maybe it was simply that she knew the desert didn't discriminate in who it killed: white, Apache, innocent, outlaw, just took. The man's name was Taklishim, though she wouldn't know that until much later. For 2 weeks she nursed him in secret, feeding him water laced with crushed willow bark for the fever, and stitching his wounds with the same needle she'd once mended Jonah's shirts with. Every night she would sit by the fire, shotgun on her lap, and whisper stories to him as he drifted in and out of consciousness about the boy she once was going to have. About her mule Bess, who always stole onions, about Jonah and the day he fell. It wasn't until the 10th day that he spoke, a single word in halting English, "Why?" And she didn't have an answer. Maybe she was tired of the killing. Maybe she needed to save someone, if only to save herself. But before she could make sense of her decision, the army came. 3 riders, blue coats, sabers gleaming, demanding food, water, and information. Clara lied, saying she'd seen nothing but jackrabbits and vultures. That night, Taklishim stood for the first time, trembling and furious, and told her she was a fool for protecting him. She simply said, "Don't die, that's all." But the truth was, Clara had already crossed a line that frontier law and settler pride wouldn't forgive. She had aided the enemy. Worse, her nights were beginning to blur, with Taklishim's voice echoing in her dreams fragments of Apache poetry and broken English slowly forming something she didn't understand yet. 2 people, raised to hate each other, sitting at opposite ends of a fire, sharing silence like it was sacred. By the time his strength returned, Taklishim wasn't just a secret anymore, he was a decision Clara had made that would change everything. And when he disappeared one morning, leaving only a carved stone by her bed, she thought that was the end of the story. But it was just the beginning. 3 months passed after Taklishim's silent departure, and Clara Whitlock returned to the rhythm of her days, mending fences, planting bitter greens in the sand-cracked soil, and feeding hens who clucked like they knew something she didn't. But the nights were harder now. They held an ache, a space beside the fire where a presence used to stir and breathe. Her dreams were thick with images of blood and smoke and eyes that stared at her like they saw everything. Then, without warning, the world came crashing again. This time not in silence, but on horseback. A Union cavalry patrol rode in hard, 4 men in dust-stained blue, and at their front rode Captain Harlan Avery, a lawman with a mustache like iron and eyes that had seen too many dead men to care about one more. He didn't knock. He pounded on her cabin door and walked in before she could reach it, already scanning the place with practiced suspicion. They'd found a trail, Apache tracks mixed with settler footprint sand they led back to her land. Clara tried to lie again, but it was thinner this time. Avery pointed at the charred bandages in her stove, at the stone carving she kept beside her bed, and said, "You're harboring savages, Widow Whitlock. That makes you one." She was arrested on suspicion of treason and aiding an enemy combatant, dragged from her cabin like a criminal. But before she could be hauled off to face military trial in Santa Fe, something happened no one expected. Taklishim returned. Not under cover of night, but riding straight into the camp outside her homestead with a dozen armed Apache riders. His voice rang like a drumbeat as he shouted in broken English, demanding Clara's release. He could have taken her by force, but instead he invoked something far older than bullets: marriage rites of the Chiricahua Apache, a sacred and binding tradition. Under Apache custom, she had saved his life. That placed her under his protection, but it also made Harif she accepted this obligation, and in Apache law, that meant wife. Clara, still in shock, stood between soldiers and warriors as two worlds collided. Captain Avery called it a farce, said no such ceremony held weight under American law, but Clara saw something different. She saw the calculus of survival etched on Taklishim's face. If she stayed with the soldiers, she'd hang. If she accepted his hand, even symbolically, the Apache would defend her like their own. And so, in a ritual that felt more like surrender than union, Clara walked barefoot into the center of a sacred circle, painted with ashes and sage, and became his wife. No church, no vows in English. Just a fire, a whispered chant in a language she couldn't speak, and a braid of her hair tied with a strip of deer hide. Taklishim didn't smile. He didn't touch her. He simply looked at her with the intensity of someone both saving and dooming her. As the Apache retreated into the hills with their new bride, the soldiers watched, seething. Avery spat into the dirt and muttered, "That ain't no wedding, that's kidnapping in slow motion," and maybe it was. But as Clara sat atop a borrowed pony, surrounded by strangers, with her old life burning behind her in the hearth she'd built with her husband, she understood something crucial. She wasn't just running from the gallows, she was stepping into a different kind of try alone that would test not her loyalty to a flag or a culture, but her very sense of self. She wasn't Clara Whitlock anymore, not really. She was someone else, now someone, caught between the boundaries of war and peace, love and survival. And while she wore no ring, the silence between her and Taklishim was heavier than iron. The forced marriage wasn't about romance. Not yet. It was about war. About making enemies into kin because that was the only way either of them could live. And in that brutal, quiet calculation, a question hung between them like a knife in the dark. Could you ever truly belong to someone you were raised to fear? The first days among the Chiricahua were not what Clara had imagined. They were worse. Every step she took was watched. Every breath she drew echoed in unfamiliarity. She was no longer a settler, yet not truly a member of the Apache camp. In this strange limbo, she became an object of curiosity and resentment. Children peered from behind huts, their dark eyes questioning. Women whispered, calling her Choga she-white eyes, though some, like Naylan, an elder healer, watched her with something closer to patience than pity. Even among the Apache, the idea of marrying an outsider, especially one who had once belonged to the settlers, was seen as dangerous, blasphemous even. For Taklishim, the tension was tenfold. He had brought her back, not out of love, but honor, a concept rooted in loyalty and survival more than affection. He spoke little, spending most of his time away on hunts or war councils, leaving Clara to navigate a culture built on traditions that seemed carved from stone. There were no luxuries, no softness, and no explanations. She ate from communal pots, learned to grind corn with blistered hands, and slept under the same hide tent as her supposed husband, always on the far side of the fire, as if they were still strangers. The nights were cold, and she often woke to the sound of distant drums, chants that rose like ghosts from the hills, and yet, slowly, something shifted. It began when she saved a child from a snakebite, using poultices and settler medicine her mother once taught her. Then she helped mend a wounded horse with the same stitches she'd used on Taklishim. Small things, tiny cracks in the wall. Nalin took her under her wing, teaching her the names of desert herbs and how to read the wind before a sandstorm. "You are not Apache," Nalin told her, "but you are not lost either." That same week, a council of elders met to discuss what to do about her. Some wanted her gone. Others saw value in what she knew. And Taklishim, usually silent, spoke in her defense for the first time, saying, "She has not brought death. She has given life." It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was a line drawn in the sand. As the tribe prepared for a migration deeper into the mountains to escape the tightening grip of military patrols, Clara found herself walking beside Taklishim more often. They didn't speak much, but when they did, it was with a kind of cautious honesty. She asked about his scars, told her which were from bullets and which from betrayals. He asked about her husband. She told him how Jonah died holding a fence post like it might stop a war. They were two survivors bound by nothing but circumstance, yet something deeper was blooming between the silences. One night, under the moonlight, she saw him carve another stone, smoother this time, and place it quietly in her satchel. It bore the Apache symbol for balance. That was the first night she didn't sleep with her back to him. But while fragile trust was growing between them, the world outside their mountain haven was fracturing. The army wasn't forgetting. Captain Avery had begun tracking Apache movements with greater fury, blaming Clara's defection as a betrayal that had to be corrected. Word reached the camp from a scout that the army had offered bounties for Apache scalps and twice the price if the scalp came with a white woman's braid attached. Clara overheard. She didn't flinch. She simply began wearing her hair down defiantly. The woman who had once feared the sound of war drums now sang to them as she ground corn, her voice soft but steady. And while she hadn't chosen this life, she had stopped trying to run from it. Still, a question throbbed like an old wound at the back of her mind. How long could this fragile peace between them last in a land soaked with blood and vengeance? For even now she could feel the weight of Taklishim's unspoken thoughts every time he looked at the rifle she kept hidden under the tent flaps, the one she never gave up, even after the wedding. They were married by fire and circumstance. Yes, but fire can both warm and consume. And both of them knew the day would come when they'd have to choose each other or everything else. The rains came late that year, not as gentle drizzles, but in sudden tempests that turned desert gullies into raging rivers and carved new paths into the red earth overnight. With each storm, the Apache camp moved higher into the mountains, deeper into a wild that even maps refused to name. Clara, by now hardened in ways she had never imagined, traveled beside Taklishim, her hands calloused, her skin bronzed by the sun, her eyes sharper, more knowing. Yet even as she learned to walk barefoot across hot rock and recognize the call of a mountain lion, a storm brewed not just in the skies but in the hearts of the people around her. Resentment still lingered, thick as wildfire smoke, especially among the younger warriors, some of whom whispered that Taklishim had grown soft, bewitched by a settler woman. It wasn't just jealousy, it was fear. The Apache were cornered more than ever, hunted across their ancestral lands like ghosts with targets on their backs. To accept Clara was, to some, to invite the wrath of the white man. And then, one morning, it came. A scout galloped into camp with news that chilled everyone. A massacre had taken place at Fort Simmons, dozens dead, settler families torn apart, and on one survivor's lips, a name, Taklishim. Whether he had actually led the raid or merely been spotted nearby, it didn't matter. In the eyes of the military, Clara's so-called husband was now a war criminal and, by extension, so was she. As news spread, the fragile peace she'd carved within the camp splintered. Accusations flew. One man, Nasha, Taklishim's cousin, demanded Clara be put through the Nadlehi Do'e Triala fire test reserved for those suspected of betrayal. It wasn't a trial in any Western sense. No judge, no jury. Just the fire and the truth it revealed. Clara didn't plead, she didn't run. She stood barefoot in front of the flame-lined path, knowing that if she faltered, she would be cast out or worse. Nalin, the elder who had once cradled her hand as she learned to grind roots, painted her face with ashes and whispered, "You walk for us all now." With Taklishim watching from the edge of the crowd, jaw tight, fists clenched, Clara stepped into the flames. The path was short, but the pain was long. Her feet blistered, her legs shook, the smoke burned her lungs. But she walked. Slowly, unwavering, and when she reached the end, she did not fall. She stood burned, yes, but not broken. The silence that followed was thick with awe and disbelief. Even Nasha lowered his head, if only slightly. The trial didn't erase their doubts, but it bought her something far rarer: respect. That night, as she sat alone under a canopy of stars that seemed closer than heaven, Taklishim approached her. "You should not have walked it," he said. "You should have let me fight them." She looked at him, her voice ragged but steady. "I don't need you to fight for me. I need you to believe in me." And that, finally, cracked the wall between them. For the first time, he reached for her note, as protector or captor but as equal. His fingers brushed the raw burns on her feet, and in that silent gesture Clara felt something shift, a slow thaw, not passion, not yet, but something deeper, recognition. The bond forged not by ceremony but by choice. From then on things changed. Taklishim no longer left her behind when he rode out. He taught her to track by shadow, to aim not by eye but by breath. And she, in return, shared settler tricks he'd never trusted before: how to make gunpowder stretch further, how to treat gangrene with salt and lye. Together, they became something else, not lovers in the usual sense, but partners in a war neither of them had chosen. Still, their bond came at a cost. One night, word came of soldiers closing in again, and with it, a horrible discovery. Captain Avery had captured a small group of Apache women and children, including Nalanon, was using them as bait. In return, he sent a message scrawled on leather and pierced with a bullet hole: "Bring the white woman, or the old one dies." Clara knew this wasn't about war anymore, it was personal. Avery hadn't forgotten her defiance. He saw her marriage to Taklishim not as a crime but as a humiliation, and now he wanted her back, not to save her, but to break her. The tribe argued, divided between risking more lives or abandoning the captives. But Clara made the decision for them. She stood in the fire circle and said, "I started this, I'll end it." And for the first time, Taklishim didn't object. He only asked, "Will you come back?" Her answer came not in words, but in the way she kissed him, quick, fierce, and certain. The kind of kiss that said, "I may never return, but I am yours, for now." As the fire crackled behind them, she rode off with 3 others into the jaws of the beast, the outline of Fort Simmons etched against the horizon like a scar waiting to be reopened. The sky above Fort Simmons was the color of a forged blade, sharp and ready to strike, as Clara approached the encampment that had once represented safety and law. Now, it was a trap wrapped in the flag she had once pledged allegiance to. Dressed in a tattered settler blouse, her hands bound loosely in front of her to keep up appearances, Clara rode alongside 2 Apache scouts and a translator, Lawson. A fierce young woman with eyes like coals who had volunteered not just to guide her, but to protect her with her life. They didn't bring many weapons. This wasn't meant to be an ambush. It was a negotiation. A gamble. A last chance to avoid bloodshed, or at least to limit it. But Clara knew Avery. Knew the way he smiled without showing teeth. He didn't want peace. He wanted to restore order. His order. When Clara walked into the outer courtyard of the fort, flanked by watchtowers and soldiers with rifles that twitched at the sight of any dark skin, it wasn't courage that kept her upright. It was rage. Not wild or hot but cold, measured, controlled. The kind of rage that keeps a woman from flinching when she sees Nalan tied to a post, her face bruised, her gray hair hacked short as a warning. Avery stepped out like a man preparing for a sermon, his boots clicking against the stone. "Well now," he said, drawing out each syllable like molasses. "The prodigal bride returns." Clara didn't answer. Not with words, just a stare that could have cut steel. Avery tried to provoke her, mocking her savage wedding, calling her Mrs. Scalp-Taker, and offering to rehabilitate her with a long stay in the fort's cellar. But Clara had walked through fire for these people. She had earned their trust, and now she was ready to burn again if she had to. She told Avery she had come to trade herself for the captives. Simple terms. Her life for theirs. Avery laughed. Not because he found it funny, but because he thought he had already won. "Oh no, darlin'," he said. "You're not here to make trades, you're here to watch what happens to traitors." And with a nod, he ordered his men to bring out 2 more Apache children, barely old enough to speak. Clara's heart plummeted. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a message. Before she could scream, a shot rang out from the ridge. Chaos exploded. It was Taklishim. He and a small band had flanked the fort at dawn, waiting for the signal any sign of danger. And now it had come. The courtyard erupted in gunfire. Dust. Screams. Clara hit the ground, rolling behind a trough as bullets whipped past her head. Lawson was already moving, slashing a guard's throat with a flint knife and grabbing Nalan by the arm. It wasn't a rescue, it was a war dance. The Apache didn't come to negotiate, they came to end it. Taklishim stormed through the smoke, his rifle in one hand, tomahawk in the other, his war cry echoing off the stone walls like thunder tearing through bone. He wasn't the calm, wounded man Clara had once found bleeding on her porch, was a fury born of betrayal, loss, and love. A man willing to set the world on fire to save the one soul who saw him as more than a warrior. Clara grabbed a rifle from a fallen soldier and took aim not at the Apache but at the watchtower. One shot. One kill. The lookout toppled, and the balance shifted. As the fighting spilled into the barracks, Avery tried to retreat into the armory, dragging Clara with him. But she wasn't the same woman who once trembled in front of him. She fought back, kicking, clawing, finally slamming his head into the stone wall with a crack that echoed like justice. "You think I betrayed my people?" she snarled. "No, I just finally saw who they were." Avery bled from the nose, stunned, still reaching for his pistol when Taklishim burst through the door. He didn't shoot, not right away. Instead, he looked at Clara, looked at the man groveling at her feet. "Your kill," he said simply. Clara stared at Avery, remembering every insult, every threat, every scream from Nalan, every child used as baitan, then turned away. "No," she said, "that's too easy." So Taklishim fired. One shot, clean. Avery slumped to the ground. The battle ended as quickly as it began, with the remaining soldiers either surrendering or fleeing into the hills. Smoke hung heavy over Fort Simmons. Bodies littered the courtyard, but the captives were free. Nalan wept. Lozan stood bloodied but tall. And Clarashi simply sat down on the ground, her rifle across her knees, the adrenaline fading into silence. Taklishim came to her, knelt, and took her hands. "You didn't have to come," he said. "Yes, I did," she whispered. "I chose this." And for the first time, Taklishim kissed her not out of ritual, not out of necessity, but with the gentle weight of a man who had nothing to prove and everything to lose. Around them, the fort that once symbolized conquest now stood as a tomb to arrogance. The sun was rising, and the path forward was as uncertain as ever. But Clara had never felt more certain of who she was. She was no longer widow, nor prisoner, nor bride by circumstance. She was a woman reborn in fire and storm, and she wasn't done yet. After the smoke cleared and the wounded were tended to, Fort Simmons stood like a ghost, its barracks charred, its walls pockmarked with bullets, its proud flag now tattered and hanging at half-mast. The Apache didn't celebrate. Their dead were gathered in silence, wrapped in hides and smoke-blessed before burial. The survivors, mostly women and children, moved with a quiet, hardened purposeno. One needed to be told that more storms were coming. Clara stood among them, sleeves rolled to her elbows, helping wherever she could, binding wounds, distributing rations, even coaxing frightened children into sleep with lullabies from a life she no longer fully remembered. She didn't know who she was supposed to be anymore. Widow of a settler, wife of a warrior, a traitor in one world, a stranger in the next. But perhaps, she thought, she didn't need a name right now, just a direction. With Fort Simmons no longer usable, the Apache moved fast, heading north toward the Sierra Madre, deeper into the remote lands that still held fragments of safety. The journey was brutal. They traveled at night to avoid detection, with scouts reporting that bounty hunters had already been sent after Clara by settlers who saw her as a symbol of betrayal. Some even claimed the military had placed a price on her head higher than any Apache chief. To be white and hunted like an Indian there was no irony in it, only consequence. Still, she didn't falter. Taklishim stayed by her side, though not always with words. They had long since learned to speak with glances, silences, and small offerings. When her boots tore, he gave her his moccasins. When her voice broke from exhaustion, he offered her water before she asked. Yet, even amid their growing intimacy, a distance lingered. Clara couldn't stop thinking about Jonah, her first husband, his grave back at the homestead she might never see again. One night, under a veil of stars, she told Taklishim about the last letter Jonah wrote her, one she never had the courage to open after his death. She carried it still, worn and sealed in a hidden pocket. "Open it," Taklishim said softly, placing it in her hands. "The dead have no power unless we give it to them." With shaking fingers, she tore the seal. The letter was short, simple words, full of tenderness and apology. Jonah had known he might die and wanted her to find happiness, even if it meant letting go of him. Clara wept quietly, not because she had forgotten Jonah, but because she could finally release him. That moment cracked something open inside her. For the first time since that terrible day 2 years ago, she allowed herself to want something new, not survival, but a future. That future came into sharper focus when they reached the sacred lands of Chiricahua Stronghold, a natural fortress of high cliffs, narrow passes and stone spires that rose like guardians from the earth. Here, among a dwindling but fiercely proud community, Clara saw what it meant to live beyond the reach of the world's judgment. Life here was not easy, but it was honest. She learned to craft arrows, to speak entire sentences in Apache, to dance at ceremonies lit by fire and drum. She laughed with the children. She listened to the elders. She buried the rifle she once clung to like a crutch, and as she did, something else grew between her and Taklishim, not out of necessity, but mutual respect. There was no second wedding, no grand gesture. One morning, she simply began wearing a bead necklace he carved for her, and that was enough. They became something rare, two people shaped by tragedy who chose to build rather than destroy. Yet the world beyond their mountain haven had not forgotten them. News came from scouts that the military was pushing deeper west, armed with new weapons and fewer scruples. The tribes were shrinking. Assimilation and violence crept like shadows. Even Taklishim, strong as he was, admitted they could not fight forever. One day, he said, "We will need a bridge, not a rifle." Clara nodded. She had an idea. It began with a letter this time, one she wrote. Not to the military, but to an old friend from the settlement days, Reverend Joseph Caraway, a man known for defending both natives and settlers when others called him a fool. She wrote with care, explaining everything not as confession, but as testimony. She asked him not for protection, but for recognition, of her marriage, of her new people, of her right to choose the life she'd carved in blood and fire. Weeks passed before a reply came. When it did, it bore a simple sentence: "I cannot change the world, but I can tell it your story." That story slowly began to spread, whispered at first, then printed in outlaw newsletters, quoted by sympathetic preachers, even debated in courtrooms. A settler woman, once presumed dead or kidnapped, had become a wife, warrior, and witness to a world no one wanted to see. Clara knew it wouldn't stop the war, but it was a start. She and Taklishim later built a small school in the stronghold, not just for Apache children, but for any who wanted to learn both languages, both worlds. She taught English and sewing, he taught tracking and survival, and together they taught something rarer, peace born from ruin. Years later, Clara would return briefly to her old homestead, now abandoned, overgrown, swallowed by desert. She stood where the porch once creaked under her husband's boots and planted a new seed in the ground. Not a cross, not a flag, just a small pine sapling, stubborn and out of place. "Grow," she whispered, "even here." Then she left it behind. As she rode back toward the mountains, the wind at her back, her heart no longer torn between two lives but finally whole, she smiled. Not every love story begins with choice, but the strongest ones end with it.